Jesus knew Lazarus was going to die. He knew Lazarus was going to rise again. And yet, when Jesus arrived at the tomb, he wept. That raises one of the most powerful questions in the Gospel of John. If Jesus already knew what he was about to do, why did he cry? Was he surprised? Was he afraid? Did he not know what was going to happen? Or was there something much deeper behind those tears? Let's walk through the story. The story begins in John chapter 11. Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This was not a random family. Jesus had a close relationship with them. John tells us that Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So when Lazarus became seriously ill, the sisters sent a message to Jesus. Their message was simple. Lord, the one you love is sick. You would expect Jesus to immediately go. But he didn't. Instead, Jesus said something that would have sounded confusing. He explained that the sickness would ultimately serve God's glory. And then he remained where he was for 2 more days. After those 2 days, Jesus told his disciples that they were going back to Judea. The disciples were concerned because Judea had become dangerous for Jesus. But Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. Then he told them something remarkable. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. The disciples misunderstood him. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was literally sleeping. Jesus then made it clear. Lazarus had died. And then Jesus said something extraordinary. He told his disciples that he was glad he had not been there. Why? Because what was about to happen would strengthen their faith and reveal God's glory. Jesus knew the outcome. He knew Lazarus would rise. He wasn't walking toward a situation he couldn't control. He was walking toward a miracle he already knew would happen. So when he finally arrived in Bethany, why did he cry? When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. And she said something many grieving people might say. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Notice something. Martha still believed Jesus could have prevented Lazarus' death, but she wasn't completely without hope. She told Jesus that she knew God would give him whatever he asked. Jesus responded with one of the most important statements in the Gospel of John. He said, "Your brother will rise again." Martha understood the idea of resurrection. She believed Lazarus would rise at the resurrection on the last day. But Jesus took the statement further. He said, "I am the resurrection and the life." In other words, resurrection wasn't merely an event. Resurrection was standing in front of her. Jesus was revealing something about himself. Martha then went and called Mary. Mary came to Jesus. And when she saw him, she fell at his feet. She repeated the same words. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Then Jesus saw Mary crying. He saw the people around her mourning. And something happened. John says Jesus was deeply moved. Then he asked, "Where have you laid him?" They told him. And then came the shortest verse in many English Bibles. 2 words, Jesus wept. But those 2 words carry enormous weight. Jesus wasn't crying because he didn't know what would happen. He knew. He had already told his disciples that Lazarus' sickness would result in God's glory. He had already said Lazarus would rise. So his tears cannot simply be explained by uncertainty about the outcome. Something deeper is happening. Jesus entered into the grief of the people around him. He saw their pain. He saw death's effect on people he loved. And he wept. That tells us something profound about Jesus. He doesn't treat human suffering as an abstract theological problem. He enters into it. He sees the pain. He responds to it. Think about the difference between knowing the ending of a story and experiencing the story. You can know that everything will eventually work out and still feel genuine sadness when someone you love is hurting. Knowing that suffering has an end doesn't make the suffering meaningless in the moment. Jesus knew Lazarus would rise. But Mary was still crying. Martha was still grieving. The mourners were still hurting. And Jesus responded to their pain. This shows us something important about Christian hope. Hope does not require us to pretend that pain doesn't hurt. You can have faith and still grieve. You can trust God and still cry. You can believe in resurrection and still feel the weight of death. Jesus himself demonstrates that Jesus wasn't only standing in front of a grieving family. He was standing in front of the reality of death itself. Death is presented throughout Scripture as an enemy. And Jesus knew what he had come to confront. The miracle of Lazarus wasn't the final resurrection. Lazarus would eventually die again. Jesus was about to call Lazarus out of the tomb, but Lazarus would later face death again. That means the miracle wasn't simply, Jesus brought one dead man back to life. It was a sign pointing toward something greater. Jesus was demonstrating his authority over death. And eventually, Jesus himself would go to the cross. The tomb wasn't the end. Jesus eventually came to the tomb. He instructed him to remove the stone. Martha hesitated because Lazarus had been dead for several days. But Jesus reminded her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" The stone was removed. Jesus prayed, and then he called out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus came out of the tomb. The man who had been dead was alive again. The mourners witnessed something they would never forget. Jesus had demonstrated his authority over death. The tears of Jesus show us that he is not distant from human suffering. He knows the outcome. He knows resurrection is coming. But he still enters the sorrow of the moment. That's incredibly important. Sometimes people think faith means you shouldn't be sad, that if you really trust God, you shouldn't cry. But the story of Lazarus challenges that idea. Jesus knew exactly what he was about to do, and Jesus still wept. So tears aren't necessarily evidence of unbelief. Grief isn't automatically a lack of faith. Pain doesn't mean you've stopped trusting God. Jesus shows us that sorrow and hope can exist together. Notice what Jesus told Martha. He didn't simply say, "Don't worry, Lazarus will be alive soon." He said, "I am the resurrection and the life." That's the heart of the story. Christian hope isn't ultimately based on everything going according to our plans. It is based on Jesus. He doesn't simply give resurrection. He is the resurrection and the life. That's why the story points beyond Lazarus. The greatest miracle wasn't simply that Lazarus walked out of a tomb. The greater promise is that Jesus came to confront death itself. There may be moments when we don't understand what God is doing. Mary and Martha didn't understand why Jesus waited. From their perspective, Jesus could have arrived earlier. They knew he had healed others. They knew he had the power to help Lazarus, so they couldn't understand the delay. But Jesus saw a bigger picture. That doesn't mean their grief wasn't real. It means their limited perspective wasn't the whole story. And sometimes that's where faith becomes difficult. We see the moment. God sees the whole story. This is one of the most powerful lessons in the story. Jesus delayed. But he wasn't absent. He knew what he was doing. And when he finally arrived, he didn't criticize Mary and Martha for their tears. He met them in their grief. That's a beautiful picture of God's character. Sometimes we may not understand the timing. We may wonder why an answer didn't come sooner. We may ask why God allowed something to happen. The story of Lazarus reminds us that God's delay doesn't necessarily mean God's absence. Lazarus came out of the tomb. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, Lazarus' resurrection became one of the reasons some religious leaders became even more determined to oppose Jesus. John tells us that the miracle had enormous consequences. And Jesus continued toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, toward his own death, and eventually toward his own resurrection. So the tears outside Lazarus' tomb point toward a much larger story. Jesus came to confront death, not just temporarily, but ultimately. So why did Jesus weep if he knew Lazarus would rise? Because Jesus wasn't standing outside that tomb as a detached observer. He saw the grief. He felt the weight of death. He entered into the sorrow of people he loved. And at the same time, he knew resurrection was coming. That's the mystery of the moment. Jesus knew the ending, but he still cared about the pain of the present. And maybe that's something we need to remember. You can have hope and still cry. You can believe God and still grieve. You can trust that resurrection is coming and still admit that today hurts. Jesus himself wept. But his tears weren't the final word. The tomb wasn't the final word. Death wasn't the final word. Because standing outside that tomb was the one who could say, I am the resurrection and the life. And that's why the story of Lazarus isn't ultimately a story about death. It's a story about the one who has authority over it. If this helped you understand the story of Jesus and Lazarus more deeply, subscribe to Bible Stories Made Simple for more Bible stories and difficult passages explained simply.